immigrants who have their F1 degree from F1 visa or PhD degree or master's degree from US, they do have certain benefits there because there are about 20,000, I believe, H1B visas that are exclusively issued to people with um, STEM degree in the US. So do try that. But the best route would be taking the time during your PhD to build your credentials and directly go the O1 route. So in essence, what I'll tell you is try to avoid J1 as much as you can. And I think this seminar will help a lot of people even before they come to US. You know, when you want to come to US, we do not get into all these details, and we are only seeing the opportunities that are ahead of us. But J1 is a trap. And the crux of what I am trying to say is avoid it at any cost and at different stages wherever you can. And in the meanwhile, another mistake that people do is, and Arnab was briefly talking about that, is during your PhD, in the first 1 or 2 years, work very hard and then try to secure your EB2 priority dates right then and there. And fortunately, it is current right now, but that might not last forever. So work towards your EB2 and O1 from the very beginning, as soon as you come to US. If you have come here on J1 visa, then you should start applying for your waiver as soon as you come to the US. And you know, your stage 3 can be done at a later stage when you are prepared to switch to another visa. But stage 1 and 2, you should make that move during your first month in the US. Don't wait for anything. As long as your DS2019 number is same, you are good to go. And a lot of people say you cannot travel. There are no issues with traveling unless you have got the waiver. Or even with your green card applications. And we can talk about details later, but I'll end it here. I think I've made it very, I don't want to spread it thin, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, that seems like a nice break into the conversation. So Bharani, would you want to add a few things more to this? Because, you know, you might have a few more pointers.
Yeah, so yeah, Jitendra gave a very good overview of everything. I think he meant EB1 there. There's a small correction, EB1 and O1. EB2 too, I think Arnab will go over this, but let me tell that what if there are no H1 offered, right? I can tell my personal story. I was an F1 to F1. I came in US with F1. I did a PhD. Then I utilized the EAD card in Cleveland Clinic. Since it was a non-profit organization, I couldn't get it to extend for 2 more years. So I had 1 year of that, but I wanted to move elsewhere. So I was offered with the National Research Council Fellowship at Army Institute here in this area. They were only offering J1, right? Either I have to take the J1 or there's no option. They don't have H1B available, right? Most academic has H1B option available, but the option I had is J1. So what if we are only limited with J1? So let me go on that for a bit. Yes, so there's J1 offered to you. It's not the end of the road, as Jitendra mentioned. It is really hard for later time where you want to get the waivers and stuff, but it is still not too bad idea to go on J1. Option 1 you get is if you're married, if you have a spouse. J2, get EAD almost instantaneously, like within 2 or 3 months of time. J2 get EAD, and they can do any number of job. Like literally, if they want to do multiple jobs, they can do. Personally, it helped me. My wife was an IT person, and the only way she could work was with J2 EAD. So it was beneficial for J2 EAD. Meanwhile, the J1 can focus on their research. Why I'm saying that is financials are really important too while you're in US, right? You can keep, one person can focus on academics and other can focus on job. That is what I'm trying to say. And as Jitendra mentioned, you can do stage 1, stage 2, NORI, no objection to return India, at any point of the time. But you have to really hold your horses onto the 3rd step. Like if you apply for 3rd step NORI, then no objection to return India document, then you cannot extend your DS 2019 or your J1 for more than what you applied for. So the key thing there is keep this in mind. And what I did is initially I got my J1 for 2 years, and then I asked my employers to extend it for 3 more years. That's the maximum extension. 2 + 3 is 5. So if you can extend your J1, the DS 2019 document to full year for 5 years, and also try to get a visa, then you're really good. And it doesn't matter when you apply your final stage 3 waiver. Why I say that is before pandemic, the stage 3 NORI document would take like maximum 3 months. Now it is taking more than 6 months. So when you really want your waiver in hand and to switch to any other visa, if you don't have your a waiver in hand, it's really impossible for you to convert while you're in US. And folks who are in India right now who didn't have waiver went to India to get their O1 visa or any other visa stamp, they could not get an appointment there. So the pandemic is likely to continue for a few more months or years. So I would suggest to apply for stage 3 waiver at the right time. But there's an option too. So there's workaround. If you don't have any other visa, there's workaround, but it's really hard. I mean, all of us on the panel are experienced with switching J1 to any other visa. So in future, that will be helpful. There are ways to convert from J1 to other visas. Divya, you're muted.
So I believe that there's some issue with the Facebook live thing. So I'll just take a break here and try to fix that.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm actually
people are asking.
I'm getting comments on my LinkedIn post also.
Yeah, people are asking
that the link is
whether-
not working.
I had a LinkedIn connect. Well, first of all, my LinkedIn is blowing up. So many connects that they have missed the webinar. The person is in India. I said, no, you have not
Yes.
missed. It is at
Yes.
3:30 night time. So if you want to, I said, okay, I'll try.
Trying to do it
3:30.
again now.
Okay.
I hope it will. But what do you guys suggest? Should we start from the beginning again? don't
Yeah,
know.
I guess
Yeah.
that's the.
Yeah,
It's getting recorded, right? So it will be posted on in full. So people can ask. We can say that like if you are joining late, please post your questions in the Facebook. We'll answer. Otherwise, the entire thing will be recorded and available from the beginning.
Agreed. And if we get more J1 questions, then we can definitely come back to it in the live
Right.
session for to answer.
Okay, so I guess now the live is working. I will just try to confirm.
Divya, can you also post the link to the STEMPeer messenger group that you created?
Yes, I can.
I mean, I'll just update it on LinkedIn because I'm getting some posts there, some comments there. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I think like we can just go ahead now. So Jiten gave us a good background about how, if when a person is coming, H1B is of course more beneficial than a J1. And Bharani gave us the flip side and telling us about, how in some circumstances, J1 can also be kind of a, beneficial visa. And as far as I understand, J1 also helps people in terms of taxation. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because I guess if you're on a J1, you are exempt from paying FICA and some taxes. So it kind of, helps to
For
save.
2 years.
Yes.
For 2 calendar years.
For 2 calendar years. Yes, that's correct. So yes, so that's like kind of another advantage of J1, not a big one as compared to the big issues which J1 waiver has. And okay. So now moving on to the next question. Again, like most people who come to US and who do not want to like stay within academia, they want to move to industry. So the next question is that do particular industry roles prefer a certain type of visa? So is it like, some bench research scientist positions would prefer that, you get some kind of visa, and the other, for example, things like consultancy or technical support, they prefer that you, have another type of visa. So to answer this, maybe we can start with Arnav and then go over to Lakshmi.
Yeah, I can take that question. So to answer this, let's get things a little cleared up. Why you need a certain kind of visa for specific positions. So in US, there are work visas available, which is specifically designed for professionals, which is the H-1B visa. The problem with H-1B visa is that it is not, there are two kinds of H-1B visa. One is the cap exempt, which is for the non-profit for the universities, and what is another is the capped visa, which is for the companies, mostly for, which is taken by the technology companies. Now, this cap exempt visas are mostly not a problem. Mostly postdocs and research associates take this visas and they work on that. But to work outside the academia, you need something which goes beyond non-profit. For that, you need something, either a work H-1B visa, which is you have to file in April in a lottery system. And most of them are taken up by the technology companies or the US graduate students. So there is nothing much is available for if somebody did a PhD from India and wants to apply in a company and want to get a job. So because there's a lot of legal hassle involved, there's a lot of time. So people generally don't want to hire somebody who is coming from another country into H-1B visa. So what's the solution? In that case, there one solution is the O1 visa, which is available for a lot of the pharma biotech companies. Considering the population of STEM peers, I would restrict myself to Indian PhDs who are in biology or biopharma or even chemistry area. So the question Deepya asked, is there any preference for companies for this? Honestly, no. It depends totally on the company. Mostly the large companies, they tend to hire people on O1 visa. I know they're like among the large pharma companies like Johnson & Johnson, Merck, even smaller companies, mid-sized companies like Denali Therapeutics, even my company Thermo Fisher, they do sponsor O1 visa. They also sponsor H-1B visa, but that is only applicable to people who finish their PhD in US, who are in STEM F1 OPT, and who already got a job in OPT, and then for them, they file H-1B visa. For fresh people who did PhD elsewhere, not much. And this visa sponsorship also depends totally on the hiring manager and the policy of the company. In my company itself, there are different units have different policies. In some units, the hiring, the leadership are open to hiring people in visa O1 visa. Other units are not. So the answer to that question is there is no straightforward rule that which role people will get visa sponsorship. So problem is that among all the people who are in USA in visa, very few people actually get hired in O1. I would say the people who get O1 visa, they're extremely lucky people. That's because the hiring manager saw something in them. They really want them in their company. So that's the connection they make with the company or the hiring team, and they hire them in O1 visa because they don't find anybody who are like them. So those are rare. I would say 10% of the cases. What happens to rest of the 90% of people? Not much luck. So you have to wait for your green card to get a job outside academia. That's the reason I promote people to apply for green card as soon as possible. And in later part in this webinar, I'll talk more about the legalities and all those things involved. So I think Jiten and Varani and Lakshmi can add on to my comments more.
Yeah, I can take this question. So I like that Arnab mentioned folks who have PhD from India and how they navigate that situation. My case is slightly different. I have a PhD from the US. And like Divya mentioned, I directly, after my PhD, went to Lycor as an industrial postdoc. So I was not in academia after my PhD, which I think is what I have seen people say is, I need to be in academia for XYZ number of years as a postdoc, get experience, only then can I apply in industry. Actually, that is counter to what is popular in the industry side. They want fresh folks who have not been in academia. And you will hear that when you when a postdoc who's been in university for 10 years applies for industrial job, they'll say, how are you going to navigate the situation? You've been in academia for so long. But wait a minute, I was told that I need to be in academia for X number of years before I apply. So there is a divide there. But having been on this side of industry, what I can say is OPT is the best tool we have right now. 2 + 1 years, 3 years. Join industry as soon as you graduate, if that is your goal. So start with the end in mind, right? And if your end is to land up in industry, I encourage people to join the industry as soon as you can, because OPT, the industry folks, the companies don't have to sponsor you. You are free, quote unquote, right? No sponsorship needs. That is the best thing that for them. They don't have to spend any money. Now, in these 3 years of OPT, what will happen is the company knows you, your work, and your value to the company. This will help them file for your H-1B. So you can get 3 attempts. If the company wants to wait 1 year, which was true in my case, you get 2 attempts for H-1B, because like Arnab mentioned and others, that there is a lottery system and there is a cap and all of those things. Now, in this lottery system, it is luck based, right? It may happen, it may not happen. In my case, it didn't. I didn't get picked up 2 times. This was before the H-1 lottery system was revised to benefit US degree holders. So I had to apply for O1 because that was my last resort. And luckily, I found out about O1 from a colleague, from a friend of mine, and he had applied. And I was the first one in my company at Lycor to have applied for O1. Nobody was there. One comment I got was that, oh, those are given to Olympic athletes and Nobel laureates. So there is an education that you have to do and that's another thing I want to say. You have to be proactive in your own case. You cannot rely on your lawyers 100% or HR 100%. You have to convince that you are worth it and you are going to, make your package, help make the package. So that was there. And I mean, a lot of stress, of course there is, but like Jiten mentioned, and Arnab, start with the end in mind and you can prepare for it. Another thing was what Arnab mentioned is green card. Again, going back to the point that if you are of the opinion that you have to be in academia for 5-10 years and then come to industry, I would say check on that again. There are options. If you're on an OPT, jump into industry right away. And obviously, like everybody else mentioned, work on your J1 or O1. As you see, like I waited 2 lotteries before I decided to go for O1. It was cut to cut. My OPT was ending and a week before I got my O1 approval. You cannot imagine the amount of stress where the company is new. The lawyer allocated to me was new to this, and me obviously was new to this O1. But I've had two O1s since then, and I'm more wiser now, I can say. So I'll end with that. But if there are any specific questions, I'll take that.
So Lakshmi, what are the timelines associated with O1? Like, for example, if someone applies for it today, so when can they kind of, think that they might get it approved or disapproved? Like, how does that work?
That is a good question. I wish people could just decide and apply today. It does not, unfortunately, happen like that. It requires a lot of, so H-1B, no preparation needed. If your HR is ready, you apply in March, April, $10 fee or whatever it is now, and then a month later, once you get approved, you submit the whole package. O1 requires extensive document package preparation. So for that, like Jiten mentioned, build your profile, right? Build publications, be on committees, have a good citation. That's not under your control. Citation is organic, but publications, meetings, abstracts, patents, all of these are under your control. So the package preparation can take anywhere if you are, have a good wherever, because people are at different, stages of their career. So if you have a lot of publications, a lot of citations, you are more ready than others who may need more time to review peer publications. So I think 2 months is really, if you're 100% doing it, 2 to 4 months, people take 6 months. You apply. The beauty of O1 though is premium processing. You pay a $1,400 fee. You can get the answer within 2 weeks, 15 calendar days. And so that is really, and so companies are willing, like Arnab said, right? Companies are willing to go for you because they think you will add value to the company, and there is a premium processing fee they are ready to pay. So it is faster and you join immediately. So if a person is ready with their letters, you need, we can talk about that as a different section altogether. All of those letters and the package and all of that is ready. You apply, you get the answer in 2 weeks. So to answer your question, you apply today, 2 weeks from now, before the new year, you will be in your new job with the O1.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to just add one thing to what Lakshmi added. So the fee, I think by the around the time when Lakshmi applied, the fee was 1400. It's 2500 now for premium processing. Another thing people should notice is like, for example, so EB1, EB2, and O1, they all come in the category of extraordinary ability, immigrants with extraordinary ability. So people like, if people are proactive following a EB1, a EB2 group that Arnav has created, if they are actively following that, they would realize that while they are building their profile for EB1, one thing is to secure priority rate through EB2. But another thing that it can help them in specific circumstances is that they have everything ready for O1. So, there is no new, you are not reinventing the wheel. And that's what happened in my case. I had secured my priority date and I already applied for EB1. And then I use the same documents for O1. You don't have to get new letters there. So being proactive is the key, but also to know what you need to collect. How do you prove certain areas of evaluation within the EB1 category or O1 category would help you build profile in that particular direction. For example, some of the efforts can be good for you to build your profile, but will be completely futile when you apply for EB1 or O1. And examples that you win within universities are one such. So I think I mentioned it in New York also. So during my PhD till now, I had about 30 awards that I won, but I could barely use 5 or 6 of them in my application. And when I was getting those awards in my head, I was thinking that I have a very strong case because of these awards. But it turned out it's not always the case. So knowing things and being proactive about things is super important. Another thing for O1 that can help you is to know is, so H1B and O1, fee-wise, what it costs to the company is the same. There is no significant difference between what company pays to an O1 visa application or H1B visa application. So company do not have a bias that way. But where do they hesitate in applying for your O1 is not many people have that kind of profile. So there is a risk involved with the company. Company do not want to, put money on you and then get your O1 visa rejected. So in that case, they have basically wasted their money because you won't be able to join ultimately, because H1B has fewer requirements in terms of profile. That's why company want to go H1B route. But again, there is a lottery constraint. So to sum it up, what I was trying to say is, if it is possible during interview, again, you should never hesitate to actually specify your situation to your employer and ask them if they can do this for you. Between J1 and H1B, if you can come on CAP exempt category, come on H1B. Similarly, between H1B and O1, if your profile is ready and company wants to sponsor you, ask for O1, because that way, O1 because O1 is merit based and H1B is not. So you are not basing your success on luck when you apply on O1B.
Those
but
are
again,
actually
not many.
Yeah, those are excellent
yeah.
points.
I should add one point here. We for O1, we told you about the best case scenario, about that it can be premium processed and you can get a result in 15 days. But most of the cases that doesn't happen, because you end up getting a request for evidence or RFE from USCIS, and to answer that RFE means a lot of more effort, and it ends up delaying the process by another 2 to 3 months. So if you are pushing an employer for the O1 route, you should keep that in mind, that the 15-day time period can end up becoming 4 months time period also, which is very much possible.
Okay, I think
True.
that's
Lastly, yeah, that was an ideal situation. And lastly, I do want to point out that companies do end up paying a lot more money compared to H1B because they fee or legal fee, lawyers fees, and depending on the lawyer, that can escalate. And while, like I said, it's value added benefit. If you are that valuable, the companies will pay for that. But some companies or units within the company, like Bernie said, may have considerations as to budget. But there is a difference in how much is paid for H1B versus O1 in a company.
right.
But in any case, I'm just adding one more point here is, I would say whenever you interview for a company or for a position, if you think you qualify for a certain visa, do ask for it. People hesitate. They think that I will lose a job if I'll ask for it. My biggest recommendation would be, in my case, my company had no clue about O1. In my wife's case, also, they were initially planning to file for H1B without realizing that she qualifies for O1. And both of us are currently working on O1 when the company did not realize that first. So we educated the company to hire us on O1. So That's just short. I think once they have done their interview process, they don't want to lose you. So in that fear, do not lose your chances and see what is best for you, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that, being aware of the circumstances and, kind of making the recruiter also understand these things might be like the way forward. So I have a question for Bharani since he recently transitioned to an O1. So do you think that, small companies versus big companies, how does the O1 sponsoring differ between them? Or is it only dependent on the money, or is it, are there other factors also affecting it?
So I would like to just add what all the three people mentioned. It is not dependent on the size of the company. It is not dependent on the name of the company. It's totally dependent on how you're educating them on the visa availability. Just like Jitan mentioned, my company never knew O1 existed, and Wire is a huge company, and Thermo Fisher too is a big company, right? So you think that, okay, their HR system should know these visas are available and they will know everything. So I waited until I get my interview shot. So I didn't reveal anything when the recruiter contacted me because I interviewed for several positions. There was a position in a company, I don't want to mention the name, but it's a very big company, biopharma company in Boston. So the first step in a big company usually starts with the recruiter reaching out to you, and they'll ask you, do you need a sponsorship? Then if your answer is yes, most of them don't come back to you, right? But if they don't answer, if they don't answer, ask you that question, and if you get a shot at the interview where you're actually facing the hiring manager, which happened to me, I was fully prepared for the interview and I killed the interview. And then the next step is, okay, oh, you did well. So here's the thing. So before they come back to you, you have your stuff ready with you. So I did a lot of research and how do I qualify for O1 and what are my chances? I made a one PowerPoint slide, just one slide, telling everything, because you can speak how much you want, people are going to forget that, and you want to make sure that you're prepared and always be over prepared. So I made one PowerPoint presentation, I converted it to a PDF document where it mentioned where I stand, like summary of me, and I also put it in there, what are my chances of getting an O1 visa, what's the timeline, and I have my documents ready from my EB1 application. If you are ready to hire me within a month, I'm going to join your company. This is literally everything in one slide. So that when I sent it to them, the hiring manager was impressed that, okay, I'm prepared for what's the next step is. And the same slide, they used it to send it to the HR, and I didn't have to educate the HR again. So the slide is ready to educate them. And then they were aware of O1, and then they got a O1 attorney on board. Again, as everybody mentioned, all attorneys are not really familiar with everything, though they're attorneys. You have to be proactive, provide all that is required, and always be over prepared. So the advantages with the bigger companies, they might have a good attorney system. Or with the startups, I know plenty of my friends who recently they were hired by startups on an O1 visa. So all sort of companies does O1 visa sponsorship, irrespective of their size. And I would say it's better if you have a startup, do not turn it down, because a startup company would want to hire you right away if they like you, and they're not shying away from sponsoring you O1. So if there's an opportunity which is coming to you from a startup, do not turn it down, and they would probably sponsor you O1 better than some of the bigger companies out there.
Okay, that was quite informative on the O1. And I believe that Lakshmi also had something to say about the O3 visa, which was completely new for me. So maybe if you could just talk about it in short, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So O3, the 3, unlike other J2, for example. So O3 is for dependents, your spouse or your children under the age of 21, for dependents of O1 visa. O2 is actually people who are relevant for the job of O1. So for example, in case of a celebrity who is on which is the easiest example for me to give, has a O1. So maybe their post-production manager will be a O2. So their O2 is not the dependent on in terms of family wise. So O3 is a dependent on O1, and O3s unfortunately cannot work currently. Hopefully that will change. So that is a sad part because H4 if you have your I-140 approved, I believe, and in J2 you can work, but O3 cannot work, even if the O1 has a I-140 approved or 485 pending, which is my case. But they can be a student, part-time or full-time. They cannot be on any active payroll. So even an internship that pays you is not allowed when your spouse is on O3. And hopefully, the Senate or the Congress will change that in the coming years, because several O3 dependents will benefit from that. But briefly, you can either apply for your O3 while you are applying for your O1, O3 for your spouse or family, or you can apply it at a later stage. It used to be very quick, 3 months, less than 3 months, but now with the pandemic and gosh, whatnot, it can take, I have no idea, over a year. I think this is my second O1, this time it took 1 year. There is one thing I want to say from my experience. When you go to India, O3, right, you have to go for consulate processing. This is the experience that my spouse faced, is that the consul office, the visa officer was not aware of O3 and O1 and gave immediately put administrative processing. It was and this has been, I have seen over and over again, even for O1, when you go for consular processing, they will give you administrative, a pause, saying that you have to show intent and ties to the home country, which is actually not true. So here is another part of educating the visa officer at the consulate, actually, believe it or not. And so how we navigated that is, I had to hire legal help, which many may not have to, but I did hire Murthy Law Firm, contacted the US office, then contacted the Chennai office. And what it was write a letter saying that, no, O3 does not have to show dual intent in terms of ties to the home country, right? You can show all of, your property, your taxes, or whatever you pay in India, but that's not a requirement for O1. And so that is how you navigated that. And even for O1 holders, we don't have a residency requirement. So while we are on O1, we can file 485, we can do I-140. So there are some caveats. So people who are going to the consulate for visa stamping, be aware of this. You may have to, push back and say that while I have these evidences tying me to my home country, I'm not obligated to show that. And believe it or not, it worked. And my husband was able to travel back and get his administrative pause unpaused. But you can bring your family with you if you want to come on O1 visa, your children on O3. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's very good to know. But yeah, it's sad that they do not have a work permit. But yeah, like you said, hopefully that will change. So I think Arnav, we should start with Arnav now about the EB1 and the EB1B and the legalities associated. And if you can just give us a gist about the different categories available for it. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so EB stands for employment based. So these are the permanent residency or the immigrant visa options in United States. So why we try to get that? Obviously, first thing is that if you want to stay in this country for long term, is obviously important for transition from a visa status to a immigrant status, and then subsequently to citizenship. So after you get green card, after 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. So that's the reason people apply. Second reason is that most of the companies, unfortunately, they don't want to go into the visa route. So whatever the O1 or H1B you talk, those are still a rare scenario in open market. Most of the people avoid touching people with a visa status, and they want to go. So once you have a green card or a approved green card petition with a employment authorization, life becomes way easier to get a job. So in the United States, there are several employment-based visa categories available. First is EB1, which is which has two subcategories, EB1A and EB1B. EB1A stands for people with extraordinary ability. So we as a scientist fall into that category. EB1B has several categories. One of them is a called outstanding researcher or professor. So anybody who works as a scientist in a university or even in a company, they qualify for EB1B, and it's a company or institution sponsored. And EB1 has a third category, which is EB1C, which is called multinational managers. So most of the that category is taken up by the technology companies for their managerial post. Unfortunately, as the most of the audience here is from Indian origin, the immigration system in US, which was developed in passed in law in 1990s, they have put a certain number of visas, and also they have put a country-wise cap. And the problem is that India is the second most populated country after China, and India with 1.2 billion people has the same number of immigrant visa available as a country with a population of say 1.2 million people. This is, you can say this is unfair. Obviously, it's unfair to people of Indian origin, but it is what it is. This is the law and we have to live with it. So this is the reason there is so much rush for so much problem for Indians as a whole for visa application. So after, other than EB1, there is other categories of employment-based visas, which is EB2, which is mostly for specialized occupation and people who come with a technology degree and work in a company in a say, IT industry. They generally apply for EB2 category. Also EB3, that is also the similar category. The thing is that all these categories has something called priority date. Priority date is the date at which for that particular country you have a visa availability. For EB3 and EB2, India has a huge backlog and the priority dates are way back in 2012. That means if somebody who came in 2011 into this country and applied for EB2 in 2012, so they are eligible to get a green card now and apply for employment authorization, all those things. But for India, so most of the other countries, for them, the EB2 and EB3 dates are mostly current. So if somebody who is a citizen of say Italy or France, when they do a PhD here, they don't have to go into the complicated and more difficult route of EB1 because their EB2 dates are already current. And while doing PhD, they can file for a green card in EB2 category and they get their green card in like 1 to 2 years. But that is not possible for citizens of India and to some extent for citizens of China and Vietnam because we have a huge backlog. So for us, that's why it is really important and not, I would not say important, it is, we have only one route to get a green card as a PhD scientist in this country, which is EB1A or EB1B. Now, you can make things little easier by doing filing because of, I think Jitendra was mentioning that developing a profile for EB1A is not easy. It takes years of effort. It takes long research career, citation, award, presentation, and you have to be very meticulous in developing that profile. Involves citation that you cannot design. It's organic. It depends on your research. So a lot of those things are not in our hand. But what is in our hand is filing for EB2 category, which is way easier, and you can file for an EB2 green card when you are doing your PhD if you are in this country as a PhD student, or if you are a postdoc, file for EB2 as soon as like within a year of coming to this country with your PhD experience and with that papers, and you are eligible for filing for EB2. What it does that it won't give you a green card for next 10 years, but what will give you is an amazing thing, which I did not know when I came here, because like many people, things were not that clear to us 5-10 years back. We were like, now things become so easy for, we are more educated based because of the groups like this. So if you file for EB2, like Divya, you came 2 years back. So now if you file for EB2 now, you secure a priority date. So you put your place in the line. Your profile may not be good enough for EB1A. It might take another 3-4 years to become good enough for EB1A. But in 3 years from now, when you apply for EB1A, you use today's date to file for your adjustment of status. And 3 years from now, our dates for India may not be current. It is current now, but it may not stay like this because we have a huge backlog. But for you, you can use the 3 years old date, which probably will stay current, and use that day to do adjustment of status. So that is the trick I tell everybody. File for your EB2 as soon as possible, as soon as you're eligible in this country, and that will do a lot of good. Doesn't matter if you decide to stay in this country or not, but file for EB2. Who knows, like when you come in a J1 in a or H1B as a postdoc, we always think about going back to India or our motherland to do work there, but not always things work out. A lot of people end up getting a better job here. A lot of people end up not getting a good job back in India. So we decide to stay back here, and that really helps if we have a older priority date in that time. So
So Arnav, how
as soon
does
as
that
possible.
matter that when you have a J1 and you're, of course, the intent is that you are going to go back, like on papers, your intent is that you're going to go back, and then you're applying for an EB2 while you're on a J1. So how does that work? Like, is it not conflicting intents that you're showing the USCIS?
It is and it is not. I know. So in paper they say that, but I know lot of people who got a green card from J1. So USCIS doesn't look into that detail, and for that reason, what Jiten was telling, having H1B is really important. So if you are in J1, fine, but try to get into a H1B. And when you are in H1B, all these things doesn't matter because H1B is a dual intent visa. So for
Please go ahead, Amol.
no, go ahead. So I think I'm done.
Yeah, so I was telling, so the intent, right? So with J1, one thing that a lot of people don't know is they think that they have to first get the waiver and then they will apply for the I-140 part, which is not true. So you can apply for
You don't need a
I-140.
waiver. You don't need a waiver.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't even apply thinking that I don't have the waiver. So that's one myth that floats around. Another thing is, yes, J1 has a dual intent. So I have been on J1 and F1. F1 also does have singular intent like J1. So the risk stays there. If there is a situation where you know that, and it's very specific to each one of us, depending on our family situation in India. If you think that, there might be a special circumstance where you are forced to travel to India, it's better that you switch to another visa, which has dual intent. But if you have the liberty to stay on J1 and not go through the H1B, and it's okay for you to stay back in US for a while, you can still switch from J1 to EB1 directly. So the reason I'm bringing it up is a lot of people think that you have to be in H1B or O1 visa in order to get the green card. No, you don't have to be in H1B or O1 for the green card, but you want to be there because you have that freedom to travel to India in case you have that special circumstances. But I-140 approval won't be affected by having F1 or J1 visa while you are in the US.
Yeah, I just like to add a little bit to that. Yes, on J1 you can apply I-140 for EB2 category. I did that to secure early priority date because my profile wasn't ready for EB1. Are there risks in that? Yes, there are risks. Only if you travel, as Jiten mentioned. So you can decide not to travel. But again, if there are emergency, what do I do? Emergency don't come beforehand. So you file for I-140, you are on J1 visa. Are there any risk? Yes, but how risky it is? Very minimal. Very minimal. So you won't be kicked out at border. You might be stopped and questioned, but there are hardly any cases, right? If you do a real survey, no one has done that. That's why the risk is there. But if you interviewed or if you took a survey of 1,000 people who have done that, I would say probably 1 or 2% may have been stopped at the border. But more recently, I haven't heard anybody who on J1 visa filed for EB2 I-140 was sent back at the border. So the risks are minimal. So you can decide if you want to take a risk, right?
Bharani, I like your idea of quantitatively assessing the situation. I wish that is true for so many cases, but good point.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. There's some questions in the Facebook Live. So Kanchan asked that I had a doubt, is the priority date for EB1 is based on country of birth or country of citizenship? So it is based on the country of birth, not if you take country of citizen, say Canadian citizenship tomorrow, it won't help you. So you will still fall into India's category.
Regarding Arnab's comment on the visa cap, I would like to add just one thing here, that in July 2021, they have approved a new rule where the country-wise cap on green card has been removed now. So they have completely eliminated that. And India and China and Vietnam used to suffer because of that. There was a cap on how many green cards can be issued to a particular country. That does not exist anymore. So it's that room is open for all. But like Arnab said, right now the priority days are current. They may not be current because it's not just about the cap. The amount of applications that comes from India and China is so huge that even without this cap, there will still be long queues. So it's best to be proactive and secure your priority days to EB2.
The bill was introduced, it never passed. So whatever we are seeing is the spillover from other countries. So that gets spilled over. So, but the country per country cap it's a congressional mandate. So it won't change until there is a law passed, the comprehensive immigration law passes. So USCIS rules won't change. So what rule they change is that whatever the extra visas they were having, because because of the pandemic, lot of extra visas which were got unused by other countries, they came back and shipped back to India and China. So while using those extra visas, they did not use the per country cap for the extra visas. But for the every year, that cap still exists, and that won't change unless there is a comprehensive immigration reform.
Right.
Right.
I agree with Arnab. What
Okay.
Arnab is saying is right. I believe so.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, my understanding was because of family-based visas, there is a 50% improvement in the overall visa that are being issued to India and China. But this rule actually back in 2018 is when they started talking about this, and they are talking about this bipartisan Eagle Act reform. But I might not be
No,
most
it did not
updated
pass.
recently.
It did
Yes.
not pass.
The
They
day
always
it passes, we'll run
like,
out on the streets and celebrate.
yeah. So
Okay.
what happens every year? It passes in the Congress whenever the Congress is controlled by a specific party, and then
I
it
see.
falls in the Senate. So it's a
So,
political
okay.
game, So
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. That's good to know.
Okay. Yeah. But like I think like Jiten and Arnab said, the queue is so huge that like with or without the cap, we'll still be in the queue. So yeah. So Arnab, do you want to add something more about hiring lawyers or doing your EB2 yourself? Like what you kind of recommend, and because you've been through that. So what do you think is like
Yeah.
the best route?
So it is again totally up to you, because it's a huge workload. There are do-it-yourself kits available for EB2. If you want to try, you can do it. Because of EB1, I filed it myself without going through a lawyer. That's why I gained so much knowledge. But I did not do it organically, because there are earlier O1 petition was available from which was prepared by the lawyer. So basically, I reused all those things and filed on my own. But the thing is, it's a lot of work. So a lot of people who wants to go to with lawyers because they want to reduce their workload, and also we are fearful, right, by nature, because we think that if we do something, we'll try to do some mistake, and lawyers will do everything. I would say for peace of mind, that lawyer fee of $6,000 to $8,000 will seem a lot less. So because it will save a lot of time. So if you want to take up that huge job and that really time consuming and involved job, if you have time from your work, definitely you can do it. Otherwise, go with a lawyer. And selecting a lawyer, there are hundreds of law firms available. And even in our EB1B AB group, we have a survey about all the available lawyers and how people are happy or unhappy. There will be always cases where people are unhappy with one specific lawyer. But there could be exempt, there could be anecdotal evidences. So you never know. So it is totally based on your personal preference. But whichever lawyer you work with, you cannot just leave everything on them. You have to put a lot of effort, because lawyers have a specific template. They may be working with 10 cases. They will not give you specific idea. And it's your petition. It's like you are the first author of your paper. It's nobody can write better than you do. So it's your research, it's your profile, it's your life, your biodata. So you have to put a lot of effort, whether you're going through or lawyer or not, because lawyer will not be able to read your life properly. You have to do it yourself.
I guess that's
So
a
that is-
great analogy about the first, author in the paper. That kind of hits, I mean, everyone understands that clearly in this group. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a bit to that. What Arnab said is totally right. So hiring a lawyer doesn't guarantee you anything. It's like hiring a lawyer is equal to hiring a personal trainer at gym. You have to still do the heavy work. You have to lift the weights and stuff. But the personal trainer, synonymous to a lawyer, will tell you what to do and what not to do, right? So you are providing stuff to the lawyer and he's building up the case for you. So the lawyer is just to build up the case for you. He'll try his best to do a case on the materials you provided. So you still have to be proactive. You have to do still a lot of stuff. As Arnab mentioned, so for just a peace of mind, it's a lot of work. I did it thrice, EB2, EB1. Every time I went with the lawyer, it will save a lot of peace of mind. And most of all, it gives you confidence. If you're doing it yourself, you feel like, oh, maybe did I do it right or not, until you file a petition, right? But if you're doing with a lawyer, it gives you extra layer of confidence to you.
Yeah. And for those who are interested in securing a lawyer, so over years, I've built a relationship with an attorney, and they also did my O1, as well as they are doing my I-485. And that, so for the company that I work with, we use this lawyer very frequently. So we have special discount for ourselves. And I would be more than happy to connect folks who want to secure, who want to use these lawyers for their petition, and ask them to provide the same discounts that they provide for the company. And it can easily save you $2,000-3,000 straight away there. So yeah, feel free to connect if somebody would like to.
Okay, that's great. So there's a very interesting question now. So if someone is on a J1 and that person files for an I-140, does it affect the spouse who is on a J2 visa? So how does that work?
No, I've recently done that. So J2, nothing happens to J2. They're still on J2. But even if the J2 wants to convert to something else, they need a waiver. So this is like a linked question. J2 cannot drive independently. So if, let's say J2 comes here on on J2 based on J1, and suddenly they want to switch to any visa, F1 visa, H1 visa, or O1 visa, any kind of visa, they need to get a waiver along with the J1, right? Both needs to get a waiver. Both as in J1. J1 needs to get a waiver, and once J1 gets a waiver, he or she cannot extend it further, right? And whatever rule applies to J1 after I-140 is filed, same rule applies to J2. So
Okay.
that's what. So, but as I said, I mean, yeah, same rule applies.
Right. And then there's another question on, like, if you are on a J1 with a 2-year home rule and your spouse is on an H1B, and they, the spouse is applying for a green card through EB1, then can you also get a green card through your spouse, or how does, that work?
Yeah, so you can get a green card through beneficiary. So the spouse on H1 who's applying for I-140 to EB1A or 1B, so they can add you as beneficiary, and both can get green card typically at the same time. Before green card, of course, you get EAD, Employment Authorization Card, with a travel parole, where you can use it to travel in and out of US multiple times before and after until your green card comes. Usually once you file for I-140, after it approves, the next step is to file for I-485, it is a status adjustment. So the green card takes time, and depending on where you're in the state, it takes 1 year, 2 years to 3 years. The current pandemic is taking us close to 2 to 3 years. So before that, you'll get an EAD, so you can get green card too. But however, whatever the J1 visa holder was on, the waiver doesn't go. The waiver stays with you. The 2-year home rule period stays with you until you get a waiver or you satisfy the 2-year home rule. So it stays with you. For I-140, you don't need a waiver. While applying for I-140 stage, no one needs a waiver. But for I-485, you definitely need a waiver.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I would like to just add that when you get your I-140 approved, you do not get AP and EAD by default. So just wanted to make people aware that do not assume that. So you apply for it during the change of status. Like for example, in my case, I did not ask for advance parole or EAD. So the only point I brought it up for people to not assume that they are automatically getting an EAD along with their green card. That does not always happen. You opt for it during your application.
and Lakshmi, I believe that an O1.
I'll add one more thing
Yes.
here. So since Jitan is in O1 visa, so this recently happened with my wife. So she is in O1 visa and she visited India with the advanced parole. But the thing is that since O1 is a quasi dual intent visa, it's not like H1B. So
Yeah.
when she comes back, either she needs to stamp her O1. If she doesn't get a stamp on O1, when she enters US, her O1 becomes invalid automatically, and she has to activate her EAD. So this is not true for H1B. H1B, you can choose to keep your H1B or use your EAD, but for O1, you have to be little careful about it.
Yeah, and that was
Yeah.
the reason I actually did not opt for it, because you have to get a stamp anyway. And so it does not solve the purpose that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, Arnab. A lot of people miss it, and most people who are recently on O1, they don't know that point, and I was educated on that point very recently. So on O1, you can travel with your advance parole. That means you're activating your advance parole. But if you are not having O1 stamp, which is very unlikely now because there's no slots available in India, so you might have to end up activating EAD. It's a very good point.
Okay. Wow. So it is actually very complex. So all this information that we're talking about right now, like for a person, who's kind of new to this or wants to kind of, know about different options, like, of course, this webinar would be like a great source, but are there also like, sources on the web or USCIS website, like, something that you guys would recommend that a person can kind of, look into when they want to, when they're getting ready?
Actually,
let Arnab
USCIS
speak. He has to speak.
website is really good. USCIS about the green card. USCIS website is really good about, they say in detail all the categories and all the things. So I would say when you have a question, Google is your best friend. Google it, but go to the US government website link. Don't go to those random places. Go to a state.gov or USCIS webpage. You will have a lot of information. And also some of the lawyers, they maintain actually a lot of blog resources, which are really good, like this North American immigration or Murthy firm. They actually have a lot of blog posts and many other, I just named two, but a lot of other lawyers, they have a lot of good resources. So when you are look for the USCIS or Department of State web pages and law firms, and of course the Facebook group we have, EB1 and EB1 big group, which is specific to green card, but we have a lot of resources there too.
I echo completely what Arnab said. Is Chen Immigration Be Green has a Q&A section. Whatever question you have, people have asked them, they have answered. But USCIS is a good starting point because rules change. Like Jitain mentioned, the 1,400 fee for premium is now 2,200. And I was aware that, but at the time there was a stay on it. Another thing I wanted to point out about the EAD and AP card form, 765 form, like Bernie and Jitain mentioned, right now it is free to file. There is a bill or a proposal to charge for each of those forms. So now when you file 765, there is a fee. Now, for all of those, there is a fee, but in the future, right now it is free. So I would say just file it. You use it, you don't use it, it's up to you, but file it, it will come to you. But rules keep changing. So to Arnab's point, start at the USCIS website. That is a good starting point. If there is anything latest, you will be aware of it. But at the same time, Be Green, Victoria Chen's, I've personally used her. I've had great experience with her, even got a great discount from her. But there are polar opinions also, and those are there in the groups that the group that Arnab has made, and also Stampiers.
Yeah, and I would say about the lawyers also. I would say one thing is find a lawyer which can work along your timelines. And one So I have actually moved from Chen to Braham Adair recently, and I would also like to add for people to know that it is not always your profile because of which you get rejected. Sometimes, and in Stampiers and EB1, EB2 group also, you have seen that people with a very average profile get their green card approved. People with a very excellent profile do not get it. So lawyers play a very important role, but your involvement should be there at each stage. That's one thing. Another thing is when you pick up lawyer, ask them upfront about the timelines that they take in order to prepare your case. And if it does not align, do not think that just because you're moving to a smaller lawyer, you have a smaller chance of getting your green card approved. As long as you're ready to work along with them towards your applications, things will work out for you.
So Divya, to add to your question, Stampiers page, when I started, I knew nothing. It was like 2 years ago. Started from, took a baby step, didn't understand anything right from applying for J1 waiver. So Stampiers page is a very good resource. And I see people are always active. Post a question, you get 20 comments of your answer. So they're a really good resource. Second, Deepa Balasubramaniam added a Slack group. It's called O1 Slack group. Same thing when I joined in there, I literally knew nothing. Now I'm very active on that, giving feedback on the experiences and stuff. So everybody's helping each other. So O1 Slack group and the Stampiers page is really, really good resource. Of course, first resource is the government page. But just like human behavior, you don't want to read through all the websites. So you want to reach out to your friend. These are the very good resources to reach out to get your questions answered.
Completely agree with Bernie. I'm here because of Deepa. She was not a friend in the beginning. She didn't even know me, but was willing and able to help. And she did everything in her power to not only help me, but many people like me. And Bernie and I
Deepa is amazing.
Yes. O1 Slack group, and we are paying it forward. Every time a petitioner announces that they have gotten it, all we say is pay it forward, and
Yeah.
while I have that, I would like to put a plug, donate. You're using Stampiers, all of those people who are listening, this is a time for you to donate, big or large, how much ever you can.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like donate. And regarding Deepa, so the way I think Varani was telling that he mentioned during his interview that he put a slide to during interview that how to promote that I am ready for O1. Actually, Deepa helped my wife to one of those negotiations, like how to prepare an email. She, between her work, she actually corrected those emails and how to write to the hiring manager that yes, I am worth of sponsoring a O1. So there are a lot of people in this group who is helping out of their time, like we are doing this in between our work hours. So imagine like how much effort it takes. So we are here to help you and donate to our cause. That will really help this group going in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, because this webinar is also, an initiative by Stampiers, and, it's a part of the fundraiser 2021. So yeah, I completely agree with the fact that, we need to give forward. So yeah, so I guess now we can just take questions. There are multiple of them. And Farzana is asking that Farzana has been on J2 visa, like from 6 months. And, they have the work permit, and she's worked for 4 years in a pharma company at India, but she's not getting any responses here. So do you guys have any suggestions? Like, she has an EAD and has experience in India biopharma company. So any suggestions?
I can,
Go ahead.
I'll have, no, Arnab, you're leaving. Go ahead, you go ahead.
So only thing I can say, this is not a visa issue. This is, I think, it's a more of a recruiter issue. So you don't talk about J2 or other things. When you are looking for a job, you just mention that I am authorized to work. Who cares you are a citizen or the EAD or whatever in the initial step? You are authorized to work, and companies don't need to sponsor. So you said that you're authorized to work, don't need sponsorship. And then it's up to finding the right match. It's about finding the perfect marriage for the companies if they like your resume. So I think that is a different part of the topic, where I think you have to polish your resume and connect to LinkedIn and find the proper recruiter. So that is a different story. But while applying, just mention that I don't need sponsorship. I am ready to work from tomorrow.
Again, completely echo with Arnav. Being a woman in science, to the fellow woman, I would like to say network. Women in science chapters are in most of the major cities. Just join that. It's WIB, women in whichever, biology, science, join those chapters, be proactive, network, and that is your first step. And like Arnab said, just say you're authorized to work. And it's the first step is to crack the recruiter screen and get in front of the hiring manager and speak to your industrial experience, what you gained, what was your learning curve, and the highlights of your achievements. And I think you can do it, but just network first, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
Farzana, just like to add, it is not hard to get job. I know I've been there where I was literally praying to get one job, and suddenly you'll be flooded with more than one job offer. Then you'll be like choosing one or the other. So I'm sure like most of the people are doing everything right, networking and polishing the resume. And if not, like just as Arnab and Lakshmi mentioned, do that. And third thing is stay hopeful because that is very needed. I know how it feels when you don't get a job, but it will pass. We'll get some offers soon.
And I think it's a very important point that you guys mentioned that, right off the bat, do not tell the recruiter that, do not scare the recruiter saying that you don't have a work permit. So I guess that's a fair point. These things can be talked about after, the initial talks. So, okay.
I would say that recruiters and HR, like 90% of the case in this company, small or medium, they don't have any idea about the US immigration system, visa system. So they just get scared whenever they see somebody needs a visa. They think that it's a lot of paperwork, a lot of official, a lot of government things. And a immigrant coming means government will be more critical towards their application. So you just don't have to like scare them at the first step. So try to not scare them that first recruiter step.
Okay, that's great. We have another question from Sanjeev, and he asked that for H-1B, if you get it in the first round of lottery, when you get to know about it, can you start working immediately after it?
No,
Yeah.
I've not been on H1, but what I know is now you apply in March, the system has changed a little bit. You put it into the list server or something, it's a small fee. Then you get to know the first, there are 2 times you get to know the first round, first year you get to know, correct me if I'm wrong, April,
So,
and then
yeah,
another
April
one
they
in
do the
July.
lottery. Yeah, so July they do actually anything is leftover. So they do
Leftover,
a
and then-
leftover, and then
Correct.
you start working on October 1st.
Correct.
Yes, that's correct.
So you apply in April and you start in October if everything goes right? Okay.
March, and then you find out first round is in April, then second round, if there is a wait list or leftover, like Arnab said, you still have hope. You can find out in July, and then you start working in.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that's another reason because of this cycle that you apply in April and you can only start in October. Some people are in a time crunch where you do not have that, leverage to have enough time. And my situation was similar. I have to immediately make a move from H1B to O1, and applying to another H1 and then getting it approved and starting in October was not the option for me. That's why I went to O1 also. For a lot of people with time crunch, apply for O1 with premium process if you qualify.
And I also believe that O1 doesn't require a J1 waiver, which is like great. Like at least at that point of time, right? Like I think you do need the waiver at some point, but not, or do you not?
Need a waiver if you need a waiver if you're trying to file green card in the future. But if you want to stay in O1 forever, then you don't need a waiver.
But the thing is, you still need O1 stamp if you are moving from J1
stamp.
to O1 visa.
Stamp. Yeah, you need stamp.
But in my case, I did not need the stamp because I already had the J1 waiver and I was working on H1B. But if you are making a direct switch from J1 to O1, be aware that you will have to travel and come back to USA.
Yeah, do a consular processing.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good.
That might take months time sometime.
Yeah, currently, yes.
Yes, given the current situation, yeah. And how long?
So I know.
Yeah.
I know somebody who works for a company in New York. He had to go for this consular processing for O1, and he was stuck in India for 4 months for the O1 stamping. He almost ended up losing his job, but somehow it worked out. But there is a possibility.
Yeah, I'm an O1 Slack group. There are like at least 4 to 5 people who are in India right now. waiting to get a slot. So they've traveled to India to get O1 stamp. So they're stuck in India. There's no slots available. The emergency appointment is not working. So it could be 4 or 5 months if you take that
Yeah.
route. And that is temporary. That is temporary. I'm not scaring people who are on J1 who want to switch to O1 and get consular processing done. In January, things might relax a bit because now F1 students are applying. So December was a crunch time. So January, February, maybe by March, things will loosen up and you may get slots so you can travel to India, get consular processing done.
Okay.
Okay, I think Divya, I have to go now, and it was really nice talking to all of you. And just shoot me a message or LinkedIn message or join our group on AB1 AB group, and I'll be happy to answer further questions. And thank you all. I hope I help in my limited capacity a little bit.
Thanks so much, Arnav. That was very helpful.
No problem.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Arnav.
Bye.
Thank
Safe
you, Arnav.
travels.
Glad to meet you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Arnav. Take care.
So I think we'll quickly go through the rest of the questions. So someone asked that what would be the best time to file EB1 on postdoc career, and what are must requirements to get approval? I guess that's a very broad question, and like parts of it you've answered, but if you have any more comments on that.
Best
Yeah, I
time
would-
is today. I would say best time is today. And in general, there are package like you should have A, B, C, and D worked out. But I beat all the odds. I'm the person who got EB2 approved in 35 citations, EB1A approved with 55 citations, O1 approved with 70 citations. So ideally, I don't qualify for any of this, but I beat everything and I got direct approval, no RFE, right? So, and there are petitions where they have thousands of citations and they get approved or they get rejected, right? And you don't know until you try it, right? And
Yeah.
you take survey, you do whatever calculation, you use AI to do, you will never get an answer. My only motto is try it. And if you can wait, like don't apply for EB1 in very first year of the postdoc. It's good to have some kind of ingredient with you, like have some paper reviews done, have some citations, and citations cannot go up. I did a very good research, but my citations are not going up. I used to Google Scholar myself. It's not going up. I was frustrated. Lawyers turned me down. Some of the big lawyers starts with a C, ends with an N, turned me down. Literally, they trashed me saying that you will never get EB1A approved. I got it approved with some other lawyer with my initiative with 55 citations. I think it's very rare these days to get EB1A approved with 55 citations. There's no cookbook. There is book where if you have qualified, if you do the check mark, that's great. But not everyone is having that good profile, but still you can try. And there's nothing wrong in trying.
Yeah.
I tried and I won it and I'm happy.
I want to
think
say
one thing-
Bharni is our poster child for sure. And I completely agree. That is the first question everybody should be asking. When should I apply? Who will decide my profile is good enough or not? The answer is you, 80%. And obviously, actually 100% it is USCIS, the adjudicator, who can throw your file out or accept it. Like at 55 citations, you don't know till you apply. Don't say my neighbor had 1,000 citations. Oh, I don't have enough. I can't apply. That mentality has to be done with and set on fire. You have to apply and be ready for rejections, like you said, from different lawyers. But the first question is, yes, there is a blanket template USCIS offers, papers, citations, peer review. Internationally, I saw one question, the awards have to be internationally or nationally acclaimed. There is a definition for that, or some others also, but these are the basic factors. But like Bharni is the poster child for beating the odds. And it is, here is one example, but there are many, and you could also be one of those. Don't lose hope and always ask yourself, can I try? And ask opinions from different lawyers, obviously, and make a strategic move, but don't give up.
Yeah, I would also like to add to Bharni. First of all, congratulations, Bharni. I think it's very impressive. But I would also like to tell the audience who are listening that people tend to believe that the only way to prove your scientific credential is through your publication and citations. No, and I think that's what worked in case of Bharni, that you put whatever you have done through your research into perspective and make it work for you. That's number one thing. And in any case, not many people have the luxury of losing money on EB1. You know, when you know that chances are sleek and chances are very high that you might be losing money, to play it safe. And all of us have been saying it, including Arnav, Lakshmi, Barney, that secure your priority dates with EB2. And you know, do not think that one day when my profile would be excellent, that's when I'll apply for EB1. And a lot of people will think that it will cost me another $2,000-3,000. Why shall I apply for EB2 at all? I would say the amount of benefits that you get with your green card approval, these numbers are very petty, you know, in front of what is ahead of you after your green card gets approved. So secure our priority dates when you're not super confident about your EB1 profile.
And just to reiterate, so even if you are on a J1, you can apply for your EB2 and you can get your
Yeah.
I-140 approved, right?
Yes,
So
and I will call it national interest waiver, NIW, because then again, I think EB2 is employer based. So it's basically NIW that you apply to, but people intermittently interchangeably use the term EB2 and NIW. So basically you're applying for NIW, which is EB2 in another sense.
and it has to be employer based, or you can do it yourself.
So NIW is self-petition.
Okay.
But there is a
Yeah.
clause, you have to be, and correct me if I'm wrong here, 3 years into active research, excluding your PhD, when you apply for EB2 NIW, I was told.
No, that is not true actually. So I applied my EB2 when I was doing my PhD. You can in fact apply for EB1 also, although it is not preferred, but you do not disqualify to apply for either EB1 or EB2 during.
You must have applied your research outside when you were working in a company or so to adjust for that 3 years, right? There is a caveat, but just be aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Lawyers do bring it up because you have to show the consistent performance within the field, and you cannot
Yeah,
prove yourself to be an expert. You cannot prove
There's a
yourself to
language.
be an expert. Yeah.
USCIS has a language, and if you can just cover that, that'll be good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just basically find another way to show that you have been in the field for a long period of time.
Right.
It's not through PhD.
Okay. So Ajit wants to know that if a J1 visa holder after 5 years, can he or she move to a J2 dependent visa? So do any of you have any insights on that?
I do not personally know someone who has done that, but if I theoretically look at it, it looks like a possibility. But know that you become subjected to another 212E rule because you are on your spouse visa now as a dependent. But the good thing is, as soon as your spouse gets the J1 waiver, you get automatically you get the waiver automatically. So yes, moving is possible, but there basically you have to go through 2 waivers in this case. One for your spouse and one for yourself.
And someone wants to know, can they change the employer during the process of J1 waiver or a green card application?
Yes. I know my friend who has changed employer during his J1 waiver, and I haven't changed employer during my green card. So I would say yes.
Okay. So you're saying like your priority date and all, they all remain, like you don't need to do it another time. If that's
No,
So
once
thing-
it,
One
Once
thing you have to
J1
understand is,
Sorry.
go ahead, Jitin, go ahead.
So one thing you have to be careful about is when you apply for your I-140, you have to wait for certain number of days. And I think it's equivalent to 6 months or 180 days. You should not change your employer during that phase. So you have to be careful about that. And for J1 waiver, so once your application has been approved, that's when you are in a complex situation. But as long as your stage 3 is not approved and you have just got your J1 phase 1 and phase 2 approved, it's okay to switch employer during that phase.
Yeah, that was a thing I was going to add. Stage 1 and 2, you apply any time of the year. For me, I applied stage 1, first month of my J1 visa. I was there on J1 visa for 4.5 months, but I anticipated I would need a waiver. Stage 1 and 2, I applied very first month waiver in J1 visa, and I holded my stage 3 until 4 years. I kept my papers and my document for 4 years. And during that time, you can switch to a different employer because J1 is transferable. They take that DS 2019 and a new employer can activate it. But once you send your paperwork to stage 3, that is to USCIS, then you cannot switch employer or you cannot extend your J1 visa too. So that's the
How
thing.
easy is it to travel to India or any other country when you have done your first 2 stages? Does it affect? in any
No,
way?
it would not affect. As I said, the risks are very minimal. And Jiten, it's actually good to know that Jiten did J1, EB1, EB2 in PhD. It's a dual intent. F1 is not a dual intent, but you're expressing an intent for immigration here. There technically on papers, it is there. Lawyers will try to scare you. Lawyers are extremely take extreme precautions and tell you do not travel. I was told the same thing. As I tell, the risks are very minimal. If it's then an emergency, you can travel, but don't make it a point like travel twice a year or something. But in extreme situations, you can travel. It should not have any effect. Or if there's an effect, it's very
I'll
minimal.
tell you, in fact, I did travel in India during my F1 OPT while my green card application was under process with USCIS. That was with EB2. But I think the biggest risk is during the change of status. That's when you are at biggest risk. Do not travel, regardless of your visa status. Do not travel during that phase. So that's the biggest advice there. Another thing people do not know about J1 waiver is because, so when I came on J1 visa to the US, I came as a master exchange student. And then I did my PhD on F1. So many people do not realize that they do not take up internship during their college days, thinking that they will be subjected to J1 waiver. So one thing that people need to know is, especially because we have young STEMPers group also, is that you can switch from J1 to F1 visa without any issue at all. You don't need to do any paperwork because both of them are singular intent and non-immigrant visas. So that's another option for a lot of people who are at the verge of losing their status and have to go back to home country for whatever reason. They can move to F1 visa if their circumstances allow.
Yeah, that's great to know. And Bharani, we have some requests for the O1 Slack group. So I think at the end of this conversation, it would be great if you could just post it on STEMPeers, like the link for it, or just on the post that we had for this webinar. That would
Sure.
be
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Lakshmi is a great resource too.
Okay.
So either of us can be,
Yes.
we can add them, or if,
Right.
yeah, we can add them. Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
I wondered, can we post a link so people? I always invite with email. I have to ask, give me the email and then add. But if you can find a link to add en masse, we'll try to do that for sure. And we only have one rule: introduce yourself, read the previous posts, and always ready. We are always ready to help.
Yeah, I think there's a link to copy and paste it, Lakshmi. I'll double check that. Yeah, if not, we can reach out to Divya and whoever asked that to be added, we can
Individually we
get the emails
can
to be
send
added.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Sure. Yes, that sounds great. And I guess we have some questions which were replied to, and then okay, now people are of course asking what's the best time to apply for EB1, and as I understand from the entire conversation is that the best time is today. So when you feel you're ready, you should just go for it. Okay. Someone is asking Jitendra that I have followed your YouTube video to file my J1 waiver. Thank you for your effort. Now I submitted my stage 3 a month ago. Could you share when I can expect my waiver clearance since I'm on 5th year on J1? I mean, yes.
Okay. I think previously when I applied for it, it took about 2 to 3 months, the last part. And because of COVID right now, things have delayed, and it's also very subjective to the CGI for your state. So to be proactive and to play safe, I would say it's taking, I know people who got it in 4 months, but I also know people who got it in like 6 months. So, the range is pretty broad. But what I would advise is do not wait for USCIS to respond. And somebody has commented on my YouTube channel with the email IDs and all that there are conversation in that YouTube video comment section. Please skim through that and realize that you can proactively send email and call the USCIS regarding your case status. Do not wait for 4 months and then realize that your case is not with them and all that. So be proactive as soon as you send it to them.
Okay.
Like wait for a month and start following up with USCIS immediately.
Yeah, after you apply for the third stage and Department of State website using your case number, you can see if the USCIS, Department of State has received all your waiver documents, including the no objection to return India certificate from the Embassy of India. And after that starts, it technically takes 16 to 20 weeks currently.
Yes.
Before it took 2 or 3 months. Now it took 6 months for me in total. So it is taking time. But as Jiten mentioned, I reached out to the waiver division, writing an email saying that where's my waiver? Where's my waiver? I used to bug them. Not necessarily that will guarantee you approval immediately, but at least it will flag them, and sometimes they may take up your case. I mean, I know there are plenty of people doing the same thing. Writing to them may help, but in most cases it will not help unless your case is really urgent. If you qualify for a expedited processing, there is an expedited processing available for J1 waiver. You write to them asking that you need an expedited processing for so and so reason. They'll ask you a reason, and if you satisfy them, you can get a waiver pretty soon, like within 2 weeks after they receive your approve your request.
And I believe that's the third part of it, right? So once you have the 2 parts, then you can apply for the expedited one.
Yes.
So this is after you apply for the third part already. This is when you expedite it after applying, after
Yes.
sending your document for stage 3.
Okay, so someone's asking that Anu was on a J2 visa for 2.5 years and currently got the J1 visa. So what would be the total timeline for me on J1 visa? Could it be 5 years from J1 or a total of 5 years for the J2 plus J1?
See, I think it's very easy to track it. If your service SEVIS, if your service number has changed, you are basically on 2 different J1 or J2. They will be treated separately for 5 plus 5. But if your DS2019 or service number is same, it's cumulative. And it's very easy to do the maths your way.
Okay, so the best thing is to look at your service ID to know about it.
Yeah.
And of course, if you have 2 service IDs, then you would need 2 waivers also.
You need 2 waivers, but then you have 10 years in hand. Yes.
Okay. Okay, I guess we have, okay. Yeah, someone asked about the lawyer and yeah. Yeah, so I guess those were the main questions that, people had that we've basically covered. So I don't know if someone has any other pointers, which maybe I missed asking or, they were not covered in the questions, that maybe we can go through that and yeah.
I would just like to add a lawyer thing real quick. I don't want to take too much time. I'll keep it short. So most people recommend one of the famous lawyer, as I said, starts with a T and ends with an N. Their group really, really big. Not necessarily, I'm not telling not to go with one or the other lawyer. You'll get mixed opinions, and you take all the mixed opinions and consult every lawyer. Most importantly, most lawyers are doing free evaluation on your case. They don't charge you a penny. So just use their free evaluation services. So you post on their website and contact them and send their resume or CV to them. And they will tell you like if your profile is good enough to file a petition. So if they are confident, then that's good. That means you have a good chance to at least get this process started. But if they say no, hey, I don't think you have a good chance, consult attorney B or attorney C until you know for sure that the lawyer is giving you, the attorney is giving you confidence. It happened with me. Attorney A didn't give me confidence. I went to attorney B. Attorney B didn't necessarily give me confidence, but they were like, at least, hey, I think we could at least give it a try. That's all I wanted. Attorney A said you have 0% chance of getting it approved. Attorney B said you have 50% chance. That means 50% rejection too. I was like ready to get a rejection too. All I need was an answer. Would I get EB1A approved or not, right? So there are plenty of fish out there. So you can try so many attorneys. And everybody's equally good, I would say, because in the end, everybody's trying to satisfy 3 out of 10 criteria for EB1A or O12. So there are plenty of attorneys there. And if your friend has got it approved with so-and-so attorney, that's the best lawyer to start with if you're confused. And I guess Arnab mentioned there's an attorney survey on EB1A and EB1B group on his Facebook. So maybe that survey is really good too. At least it gives you overall statistics of satisfaction with the attorney.
Yeah, if somebody is looking for discounted service, feel free to reach out. I can connect you with my own attorney. That's number one thing. Second thing is, another biggest advice that I can give to people is So there are 3 out of 10 criteria for EB1 and 3 out of 8 criteria for O1 that you have to satisfy for getting your approval. What people try to do and people need to learn is that do not spread yourself thin across multiple criteria. For example, if you do qualify for 6 criteria, still apply for just 3, because it does not matter after 3 whether you apply 4, 5, or how many criteria do you satisfy beyond 3. It does not matter. So it's best that you juice up the top 3 criteria and add more meat to it instead of spreading yourself thin. That's something that you have to be careful about. Another thing with O1 that and I'm randomly adding information here based on the talk today, is about O1. Though premium processing can get you your approval in 15 days, by default, even if you do not go to premium processing, if you have leverage and if you have time, the default time period for O1 is 2 to 3 months. So if you do not want to, or if your employer does not want to spend extra money, even without premium processing, it's very fast, unlike other visas. And finally, regarding choosing the attorney, I would say that I actually so I applied for EB2, then applied for EB1. I got RFE, and then it got rejected. 5 months of work in vain, and then I immediately switched the attorney. In a 1 month period, I got my green card approved, I-140 approved without RFE. So I think the only thing that changed between that is I switched my lawyer, and I also became super proactive. So first time, the mistake that I did was I relied on the attorney's expertise blindly without being too involved in it. So second time, and we talked about it already, that be super involved in your application and do your homework well. Like Bharani was saying, if you deem one particular attorney not so good for you, go through multiple attorneys, and the evaluation is free. So it does not hurt to go to multiple attorneys initially.
I have one thing to add,
Yeah.
is that all of the feedback that these two gave and Arnab on point. One thing I'll say is when you're beginning this journey, and Bharani touched on this, be hopeful, right? Finding attorney, don't compare yourself to your neighbor or your friend. He got it, why didn't I get it? I will get it, he got it. Don't do that. That's never going to help. But yeah, start with the lawyer that your friend used, for sure. O1, again, yeah, what Jiten said, hit the first 3, make it plumpy, and go with the best possible. Don't think that if you meet all of them, you will get it. That's not the case.
Yeah.
There is one thing I always hear on the Slack group, the salary. If you have a higher salary base, that can I apply? Most likely not. The answer is no. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
it may break your heart, but no, you have to be, that's a different category, another discussion. But I'll tell you my story. Starts with a C, ends with an N, attorney, right? I had a long relationship, you can call it, right? And I actually spoke to Victoria too on the phone. I was not able to afford her services for a long time. And before I was even on O1 and I didn't know what I was doing. But their feedback to me was apply for EB2 NIW and then EB1B, where we were preparing the petition together. I said no. So even if you like an attorney, there may be instances where you may have a conflicting opinion. Trust your gut. So I didn't go for NIW, I directly went for EB1B. Luckily it worked out, and luck is a big factor again. People who have citations on one extreme get it, on the other extreme don't get it. There is no head-to-head comparison. There are unique features to say, for example, Bharani's profile that you may not know unless you actually open the package and read it. So don't compare, start today, network, and get free evaluation from attorneys. And always don't ask everybody's opinion, but at the end of the day, go to the real source and double check, because you may have one set of mindset, oh, this person said that is true, that may not be the case. And also rules keep changing. So be aware, awareness is key.
Yeah, I just like to add one more thing. And again, citations are not key. Don't compare citations. And most important thing is, a girl in O1 Slack group mentioned about this. Her name is Anushri. Mental health preparedness is really important. I lost sleep thinking about this. Will I get EB1A before my J1 ends? What if it doesn't happen? Would I need to go back to India? All these thoughts are there. No one speaks about it. Outwardly, everybody seems to be successful or strong. But mental health is really important. When you are in the journey of J1 waiver and EB1 approval, this is the key of everything, even before your profile. Even if you have strong profile, if you're not in a strong state of mind, none of this would work. You should have to be really strong. Be prepared for rejections. Now, I was prepared. I was prepared to go back to India too, because only then you have to be really brave. If you're like, oh my God, what happens if I get rejected? Would I go back to India? That thoughts will come. I was having negative thoughts as well. But you should have a bigger heart, accept it. But most importantly, have a very good mental state getting into this. You will lose sleep, but be prepared for all these things. Now, speak to everybody. And I mean, STEM peers and own Slack group people are really helpful. I'm ready to help whoever wants to get information. Again, take care of your mental health. Really important. Don't get super stressed about any of these things, right? In the end, as Lakshmi mentioned, luck is the factor. I believe I'm lucky, though I can tell I put in a lots of work on my own, on my petition, O1 and EB1 petition. I read literally every line. I used to sit in the weekends in my office, not even at home. I went to my office. All my weekends were spent in the office, sitting in the dark, staring at the computer screen, reading every line of my petition. But I would like to consider myself lucky to get it approved. People with 1,000 citations may get rejection too, but of all things, have a good state of mind, stay strong.
We all carry the scars. It is a battle, and no battle you can come out without any scars. We all carry the scars. We're sitting here smiling, but we all, like Bernie said, all the scars we carry, and that is why we want to pay it forward, so that if we can help you avoid one mistake that we made in our path, that is one victory for us, so that you can make new mistakes. Why make the same mistakes we did? And just pay it forward. Yeah.
So I think that was an excellent point about, taking care of your mental, physical health, so that, you are fit and fine when you are, going through this process. So yeah, that's really important. And, now I would also like to tell our audience that, they could connect with the panelists on LinkedIn. That would be a great, platform to connect with them. And like, in STEM peers also, you can post your questions. Like, people are, always there to help. So don't consider yourself alone. And, you have so many people, although you don't even know them. But yeah, STEM peers and LinkedIn are your best friends, I guess. So yeah, and yes.
Divya, I would add one more thing here. Since we talk multiple times about citation and profile building, and I do not want to miss it out, because something that I missed during my PhD and postdoc. So I don't have a single review article, and I think I should have one. As soon as I started my master's or PhD, I should have worked on a review article when I did that, because you get a lot of citation on the review articles that you publish, and it will help you extremely well when you during your cumulative number of citations. Most of them would be coming from a review article. I did not have that leverage. People who are in the early stage of their career doing PhD or postdoc publish review articles, at least for the citation sake. So it's, of course, it is organic, but there are publications category that can give you more citation than the other, and review articles are one such category where you attract more citations easily.
Good point, Jiten. And I don't want to belabor the point, but people who are in industry, like myself, I was never postdoc in academia. There is, and lawyers will say that you don't have publications, you're not showing active contribution. So I was lucky again as a factor, 2 publications as a scientist when I was at Lycor. And so that changed the game for me. Although my citation count was less, not like Bernie's, but was less compared to people in the thousands. So I would say, even if you're in industry, there are things you can't publish because of, intellectual property rights and whatnot.
Yeah.
But if you can publish a review article, which is what I did, one of mine was a review article, and clear it with HR and all of that, obviously, that can help in your EB1 petition while you're in industry.
Yeah, and another thing is, so see, I worked in Biocon before my PhD. And so I worked on molecules that got FDA approved. They were not part of my EB2 petition, and they were not the part of my EB1 petition when I submitted it the first time. I completely ignored the science that I did in industry, thinking that, the only science that you do is what gets published. That is not always true. So you have to also connect dots and find different ways of showing your contribution that you are making in the field of science and research. So I got a letter from the reporting manager that I work under the next time that I applied for EB1, and that really helped. And I think I truly believe that that was the game changer in itself. You know, him writing that I worked on molecules that are FDA approved now changed the game for me. So do not ignore the non-published part of your research. There are ways to show it and make it use for you, make it work for you.
Yeah, I would like to reiterate that point. Though my citation count was less and nothing quantitative to show, same thing like Jiten mentioned, the stuff which I worked in my PhD days, those molecules are used by the MD PhD guy who does research on children's like neurological disease. He's the best doctor in US. He received award since 1983 till 2019. He got best doctor in US award. He gave me a letter. Coming from an MD PhD guy who's doing research, and he mentioned that my molecules are groundbreaking and could act as a drug for these young children who are having these neurological diseases. But the citations on that paper was 10 or 15, but the letter made the difference. So it's coming from the big guy. So that makes difference. So there's always something, there's something. You keep looking. Like it's like a treasure hunt, keep looking what you have, and until you submit a petition, you will have something to find. You will miss something.
Yes.
I was like, until the day I get like literally, okay, I'm done looking. So I like literally made sure there's nothing to find. Like, as they say, leave no stone unturned. I mean, sounds cheesy, but no, that's the way to get to it.
And a person looking at his profile will say he has less citation count. Oh, he's lucky. You don't know until you open the package what has gone in along with the blood and sweat. So
Right. Yeah. So I guess like the most important thing is for you to be your own champion, you know, that you need to believe that you've done something which has made an impact. And that's when you can make, you know, the others believe and the USCIS believe that, you're worth being here. So, yeah.
I just like to add one quote. I'll stop talking. I like Michael Jordan. I keep saying this in O1, and few people use that motto to get their O1 approved. So it's from Michael Jordan. As long as it is unknown, I have a chance. So he used that quote to win all his games. So I used that to get my EB1A approved, O1 approved. So no one knows. No one knows. Not even attorney knows. So as long as it's unknown, you have a chance.
Yeah, that's excellent.
while we are at quotes, I would like to add one. That is a beautiful one. I wish you had told me that, but now I'm lucky. It's done. Start with the end in mind. What is your end game? You want to stay in the US? Think of all of this. You want to go back? You think you want to go back to India? Don't worry about all of this. But still, like Arnab had said, even if you think you're going back, have a backup plan because you never know how life changes. So start with the end in mind.
Right. Yeah. That is so fair. That's a fair point. So any closing comments? Okay. So
Jiten, would like to add quote?
I have many quotes to add, so I'll keep it for some other day. But one thing I would like to say is, when you come here, regardless of whether you want to get a green card or not, it's worth every bit that you put efforts in, doing your research well, doing your work well. It will pay in some way or the other. Take it seriously and have long-term plans that will help, and be aware. I think education, educating yourself in time, realizing what you need to build a profile, and finding alternative ways to build a profile. For example, if you have lower citation count, if you have lower publication, find alternative ways. And these the categories that USCIS asks for, it's very subjective in nature. They have not defined that this is what we are looking for in this category of evaluation. So try to just sit down with yourself and keep accumulating as many points as you can, and narrate a story well in your petition, and make every bit of your work count. Even when I say that your awards that are not national and international level cannot help you directly in your green card petition, still make them count somewhere, either in those letters or some part of your petition should be covering everything. Do not miss out on anything. Yeah, and I wish you luck. And if anybody wants to connect, they are more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I have a YouTube channel. That we can do this journey together, help each other, and help fellow STEM peers and peers in working in industry or academia, I'm always available to help. That's the end message that I want to give from my end.
I guess that's the spirit of STEMPeers, and it's like so wonderful that there are so many people willing to help. All you need to do is ask. So yeah. So at the end, I just want to post a disclaimer saying that, of course, this was a personal webinar, and all the views which have been represented on this forum are personal and belong solely to the presenter and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the presenter may not be associated with in professional or personal capacity unless they have explicitly stated otherwise. So yes, so thank you so much.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah,
Yes.
you have to do this. Yes. So, okay, thank you so much. This was so, enlightening for, I'm sure, so many people. And there are other questions that I'm sure those people will reach out to you guys on LinkedIn or on STEMPeers, and they will get their answers. But yeah, thank you so